Hi, I'm Maddie Watkins, player of electric zithers and the lover of unusual music, and this is another episode of the Annals of Minimalism, brought to you by the University of California, Santa Cruz, and recorded at the studios of UCSZ in sunny Santa Cruz, and also lately at my house, with my cat lying on the keyboard. Now, if you know your early minimalist music, you'll know that what we've just been hearing is the classic shortwave piece by Thompson Augustus Shaw, entitled Himalayan Snowfield from 1966. The piece, which, by the way, is well respected in music circles, was produced after Shaw's trip to Nepal, where he unfortunately contracted hepatitis. The trajectory of Shaw's musical development after this recording, feedback experiments, some experiments with indeterminacy, and then finally the long duration pieces of Shaw's mature period like Thousand Year Gong and Singing Bowls of Alpha Centauri, is now the stuff of music department dissertations. A fascination that has been especially fueled by Shaw's subsequent silence, which began in 1996 and was interrupted only once in 2001 by his singing whole tones on the note A at the Roulette venue in Brooklyn, New York for 6 hours. Since then, he has stopped performing or releasing music of any kind. The music Shaw did make during the high-impact time of minimalist composition, say between 1965 and 1971, were all released on Hertz Records, an independent label out of Syracuse, New York, and associated with the State University there. The curator of Hertz Records, Professor Arnold J. Wentz, Ph.D. of the German Language Department, is here with us today in honor of Thompson Augustus Shaw's 90th birthday to give us some recollections of Shaw's work on the Hertz label and on Thompson Augustus Shaw, the man himself. Welcome, Professor Wentz, to the Annals of Minimalism.
Sorry about the surface noise, as it were. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? I'm getting some coffee. And I'm going to get back in the car. I'm so in love with the sound of the inside of an automobile. It's the ideal recording venue. As long as you can boost the low end, it makes me sound a little bit less like an oboe.
Sure.
So are we talking about Shaw? I have so many stories to tell. It's just such a shame if it's only about Shaw. You know, I did go one time to Paris to interview Pierre Schaeffer. You know his work, yes? And the flight from JFK was, in fact, struck by a bird.
You know, I was really hoping you would talk a little bit about Thompson Augustus Shaw and his legacy on Hertz. And especially the work you did with him before you sold the label in 1972.
Didn't sell it. I mean, the way I see it, the stopping was consistent with the music a bit, because the music, first of all, was about the oscillation between sound and silence. And once Shaw and the others were experimenting with the long-duration silence, for example, the silence that was part of the performances of Thousand Year Gong. It was actually part of one performance of Thousand Year Gong, and it seemed only right that I could take a break for a little while myself, because I had to prepare for my tenure review. You have no idea what I had to go through for that recording at Castelli Gallery of the glass harmonica piece every other day in July of 1967. And it was a very hot July. I had to go to Shaw's loft in Soho and make him a hash milkshake. And it had to be this very particular kind of hash. And even though he was dealing at the time, he wanted the hash to come from some other dealer, because my ability to get the hash was an indication of my seriousness as a producer. I had to get the hash, I had to take it to his loft, and that's where he and his partner Devereaux, who was studying Ikebana, would drink the hash milkshake and then argue about flowers for several hours. And this part is the best. They were not using a 24-hour per day clock. The 24-hour day, as they thought, was based on rigidifications of the human spirit brought about by Hipparchus, blah, blah, blah. And Devereux was vehement about this kind of thing. Hipparchus had perverted the Babylonian astronomical measurements. No, I want the double espresso with the macadamia milk. It's right here. Yes, it's the container that I bring every day.
If you want to record another day, we could.
The thing was, they had their clock on an AM and PM model, but their PM simply had 13 hours and 9 minutes in it. And so if they said 3 p.m., this is what I'm trying to tell you, there wasn't a chance that it was actually 3 p.m., not as you and I would understand. And so scheduling the Castelli show and getting the guy there with the reel-to-reel deck and the microphones, I had an assistant, and it was her job to call Devereux periodically and just to ask her what time it was where she was, which really irritated Devereux, I can tell you that.
Was there any recording in that time you couldn't get from the Shaw period, like a lost cause that might have been, for those of us who love the music from this period?
I should have called the label Utter Futility Recordings. There is one story that has to do with Amagansett on Long Island. Don't ask me what Shaw and Devereux were doing out there. They don't drive. But somehow Shaw and Devereux were out there staying with someone. And they'd been at the beach near Amagansett, and Shaw heard something in the sound of the surf that he said he hadn't heard anywhere before. He said it had a very particular overtone sequence. It is fair to ask how many people go to the beach for the overtone sequences. I mean, there is that sort of feeling of peace that you get. Like when you park your car in the lot and you're not at the beach yet, but you know the water is just over the lip of that dune right there. You can hear the surf. When you can hear the surf from the parking lot, you get this big swell of being there. And I am not immune to that feeling. Personally, I don't go to the beach that much myself. I'm not sure that Shaw did either, but mostly because he and Devereux were inside smoking hash and playing the Shruti box. But maybe that stretch of shore wasn't really different than any other. Anyway, on the phone, Shaw was saying all this incredibly ridiculous stuff at top speed, all about the relationship between wind and sea and the essential particles of sunlight and influence of the particles over the tide and wind. And he said the droning signal at Amagansett was like a sound that freight trains made in the Southwest when he was in graduate school. And the freight trains, the ones that go through town, had this particular intervallic something or other, some relationship between mass and bulk, and notes in the bass register and the kind of steel and the wheels on the tracks, and the relationship between wheel squeal and train acceleration. I think he said it was a ratio of 128 to 81, and don't ask me how I can remember this, but you know that when you listen to an obsessed person about intervallic ratios for long enough, some of it sinks in. So Shaw had extremely emotional feelings about the freight trains and the 128 to 81 interval. He would talk about it with tears in his eyes. Can't you hear how much better the signal sounds in the car? I often think about how the car is such a splendid sonic environment. And I wonder, what do you think? Do you think that they think about sound deadening in the automobile industry?
I had a minivan with the kids, and I always thought it actually sounded a little tinny.
The base models probably don't have enough carpeting.
When I was younger, I actually had a Honda Fit, and I recorded a couple of songs in there.
Anyway, this spot in Amagansett was not developed, and later they made it into a wildlife refuge. And I think Shaw must have gone there for a beach party or something. He said that it had that 128 to 81 interval, which he said acted upon the human nervous system in this particular way, just being there. And if I just recorded this area and released it on Hertz, then we would be doing this tremendous good. It was probably, kind of high at the time because that's how it was back then. But he insisted that a recording of the surf at this particular beach would stop military conflict. If people could just, on some widespread basis, hear the sound of this surf, since it was impractical to bring, the decision makers of the Pentagon over to Amagansett, especially without disturbing the ecosystem, at least I could make this recording and release it on Hertz. So the first day I was at the beach with him, I think I was probably very impressionable. I was willing to believe anything. I don't know why I was willing to believe anything, but I was. And the reality was no recording on Hertz had ever sold more than 500 copies. Maybe 1,000 if something was really hot. Anyway, I didn't expect recording the beach at Amagansett was going to create some sort of creative, harmonic, universal convergence, but that was Shaw. He was also working on the brass piece, and he had let me hear a rehearsal, and it was really good, so what the hell. We agreed that we really needed very good recording equipment, and there was an issue of how we were going to get that equipment to the beach because it wasn't like there were outlets there, and so we'd have to have a good homemade battery pack and lots of tape, and we'd need microphones that didn't malfunction in humid conditions, and we'd need to record after the season was over, once school was back in session and the kids were gone. And Shaw was really worried about this part because he felt that you needed a sunny, unstoppable feeling that you got in summer. He wanted a variance from the town where the beach would be closed indefinitely, except to us. And Shaw was also worried about the possibility of seagulls. It was a thing that came up a lot. By the way, I'm really sorry about these sirens. I tried to pick a spot that's not too close to the fire department, but some days it's just, it happens. Jesus, the seagulls. I'm thinking back, it's almost like the ones in the Jersey Shore. They dive bomb your sandwich. I brought this grad student from upstate, and she was going to help carry the equipment, and also she was going to chase off the seagulls. If she saw a seagull, she was going to run at it silently, run it down the beach, but not making any noise. Actually, she's my wife now.
I was going to ask you about that. Ann Chen, she has credit on some of the later Hertz recordings.
Right. Well, these days she's doing performance art and installations. Shaw had a very particular binaural recording apparatus that he liked, and it involved bringing part of a mannequin to the beach, a real mannequin, to facilitate the microphone placement that was exactly identical to his first experience of the surf on this spot. And so we set up the mics on an array around the mannequin's head, and as we did this, Anne was flapping down the beach like a pterosaur trying to keep gulls away. Finally, Shaw pushed the red button on the TIAC deck. Deborah was back up by the dunes. She was wrapped in a basket full of towels because she didn't like the sun. I was waiting for her to pronounce some aspect of the production totally unsatisfactory, because that was the thing that she inevitably did. The initial recording lasted for the length of one 1,200-foot reel, 2 hours and 8 minutes. And so we sat there on the beach for 2 hours and 8 minutes. And first the recording was about the ambient qualities, listening to what the microphones were listening to. But Devereaux had packed the hash milkshakes, and we were drinking them quietly. And so that after a while, the sky and the sea and the beach were one. And even if the police had come along, they couldn't have distinguished us from knobs on driftwood. And the waves rolled in, and the waves rolled back out. I guess I noticed Shaw was getting pissed off at a certain point. He got up and he stalked down the beach, and I could see, I could intuit, hell, I had even prepared for him to disrupt the whole thing. There would definitely be an imperfection, maybe a different one from whatever Devereaux would find unacceptable. Soon the two of them would get into it, and later Anne told me that Shaw walked down to where she was and told her that she was being too animated with the birds, and these gestures would have implications on the recording, even though she was 50 yards off. The good news is that Anne thought this was really funny. And eventually the tape ran out and the right-hand wheel was skittering all around, and that's when Shaw really boiled over. Something's different! Something's not right! The drone is different from before! It was better before! This is almost exactly where I was the last time, but something's different! And they had listed Devereaux, of course, who stalked down from her seclusion. And of course, Devereaux is going, yes, there was a different interval. It's not 128 to 81. So I ticked off all of the possibilities of what could have been different. You know, the tide could vary in the lunar cycle. The seasonal currents could be different. The wind could be stronger, or maybe coming from a different direction. It could have been more humid. There might have been sunspots or construction nearby. The historical context of the recording might have changed since we first discussed it. So that now it was a recording about recording instead of just recording. All of this seemed to draw him up short. He fell into some kind of silence. And eventually, we packed up the equipment with the idea that we would meet again and try anew and mate next week, with failure all being part of the process. You know how this is going to go, right?
You spent months and months and months on it?
He decided that the missing ingredient that first day was fog. Of all the difficult to reproduce weather-related phenomena in the Hamptons, Shaw chose fog. And in particular, he chose foggy mornings and high tide. He went back to New York City and he studied the weather forecasts, which were less reliable back in those days. And Ann Chen and I drove back to Syracuse, and then he started with his relentless telephoning over the course of months whenever there was fog in the forecast, and it was my responsibility to get from Syracuse to Amagansett by 7 a.m. with the gear and my assistant and meet him for the recording. That is a 7-hour drive on a good day.
And you never got the right recording?
We got lots and lots of recordings, and we got lots of recordings in the fog. Low-lying banks of fog, various gradients of fog, fog like the proverbial pea soup, fog that burned off, and Shaw became a kind of an expert in fog, and you could talk a lot about climatological conditions that might produce fog, sound propagation in fog, that kind of thing. At one point he actually became convinced that the day that he had been at the beach, when he had had the revelation about ocean waves and harmonic intervals, that there had been a lunar eclipse that he had been unaware of at the time. And that was what was called for, not the fog and high tide, but fog, high tide, and lunar eclipse. And if I remember correctly, he wanted a penumbral eclipse. I think there were maybe 5 or 6 of those in the 20th century.
So are you still working on the project then? Like, would you describe it as a project that still could be completed?
Technically, the project is ongoing, though I believe that Shaw would have to live another 12 or 13 years for a good penumbral eclipse in Amagansett. At least the weather forecasting is better now. I have AccuWeather Premium on my device here, just in case.
So what happened to the tapes?
Yeah, well, Shaw was a bit scattered in those days, and it wasn't a surprise, really. He could put his glasses down and maybe sit on them, or he could forget about a commission. He could borrow equipment and then never give it back, or sometimes he would do the opposite. He would lend you equipment and never ask for it to be returned. And all of this time, while talking about the ratio of 128 to 81. And I tried to exploit these lapses. The thing is, I kept the tape from the first session, and I didn't keep it for the obvious reason. I kept it for a personal reason, but I did keep it. It must have been August when Shaw finally called me. It was 3 or 4 months later, and he said, "Where's that tape?" And I said, "Well, I've been meaning to ask you," and that is where the really big fight began. I asked Shaw if I could have a co-composing credit on the project under the theory that no one could have been said to compose the sound of the ocean in Amagansett. To be honest, I had lost a lot of money on those early Hertz releases, thousands of dollars. If this ocean recording somehow took off, I felt that would compensate me for some losses on the earlier Shaw recordings. Well, you can imagine how this conversation went. In his view, of course, he had composed that ocean piece in that the edit was his, this minor sixth interval, 128 to 81, and I had betrayed him by suggesting otherwise. Never mind that the recording we made that day allegedly did not feature the interval so desired. I think it was that moment when our relationship turned sour. And later, as I think you know, it was his total silence. The thing is, despite everything, I know music was made for that piece. And I ask you, so where is the music in what I've described here? Is the music in the recording itself? Is it in the faint distortion from the technology of the mid-60s? Is it in the preparation for the recording? Is it in the ongoing nature of the recordings? Is it in Shaw's monologues to me on the phone about the fog and eclipses? Is it in the debriefing sessions afterward? Is it in the sound of the traffic in Amagansett, the drive from Syracuse? Is it in the movement of the planets? Is it the background radiation? Is it coming from aliens? Is it in the uranium underneath the beach or the development on Long Island? Is it a music of industry? Or is it in this conversation? The back and forth between you and me, music of reflection and recollection of days long ago. I know it's in there somewhere, the music. And just for the record, that is why I saved the tape, because it was the day that I knew that I was falling in love with Ann Chen. I thought it was probably on the tape, that moment. That was the music, maybe.
And that is another episode of the Annals of Minimalism, brought to you each week from sunny Santa Cruz, California. I'm your host, Maddie Walker, former contrabass player of the new music quartet, the Quantum Entanglements. Next week, tune in as Francois Lundy plays excerpts from her series of curated recordings, Electrical Substations of the American Southwest. We'll be touching on the historic sexism of American music programs and ambient room sounds from science fiction films, including sharing our love for the sound of Deckard's room from Blade Runner, now available in a 12-hour loop on YouTube. And as always, on the last Friday of the month, here's a recording of my cat named Goose.
He would be the next